For the record, history on tap at the Cantilever, January 16th, 2026. Well, welcome everybody. My name is Mike Williams. I'm president of the Couchiching County Historical Society. To my left here, I have Ashley Levine. She's our executive director of the museums. And to her left, we have Bob DeGrosse. Bob's a member of our board of directors and also is the retired superintendent of Voyageurs National Park. Bob was there 9 years. The subject this evening is Voyageurs National Park and its story from the first proposals and the office contentious meetings to gain support of the park, its reality, and then the rocky road as to where it is today. I should mention that most of my talk this evening will be from my own recollections, although I've done some research to keep an accurate timeline. I first would have heard of a proposal to have a national park on the Kaptolama Peninsula in 1962. During that summer, the governor of Minnesota, Elmer L. Anderson, visited the Kettle Falls Hotel along with Representative John Blatnick and his assistant James Oberstar, who incidentally both were frequent visitors to the hotel. They visited with my parents, and after a while I got my feeling that my mom was in support of the proposed park, but my dad not so much so. So little did I realize at the time that this issue would be so decisive in our community. But news outlets began talking about it, and so soon it was an item of discussion and debate, even in high school. I remember Mr. Kelsted's class in civics my senior year when it was brought up numerous times. My good friend Les Eklund, he's the man that brings the peaches here every August, we were both suspicious because he was worried about the lake cabin that his family was building in Saginaw Bay, and I was worried about the future of the Kettle Falls Hotel. Both of us were hunters. But during the last half of the 1960s, the news was dominated by the Vietnam War. And at that time, I was a student at Minnesota Duluth, enjoying the good life at Kettle Falls. Both worked and guided fishermen in the summer months, and hunted, fished, trapped, and snowmobiled the rest of the time. The proposed Voyageurs National Park was at least weekly news, with many letters to the editor of the Daily Journal and the Duluth paper, and on both sides of the issue. Informal meetings were held at Kettle Falls. One of my jobs at Kettle Falls was to boat people to and from the hotel to Ash River. And many of these trips, I had people aboard that were both pro and anti-park, often at the same time. And that's what I call my fly on the wall period. I was able to overhear conversations from both members of the VNPA, which is the Voyageurs National Park Association, and the multi-use folks prior to their gatherings and meetings at the hotel. The trip would normally take about a half hour each way, but they would have me slow down so they could discuss the agenda in more detail. If there was a difference of opinion on the boat, it always seemed to be handled in a civil manner, at least on the trips that I took. But needless to say, I learned a lot. But one humorous incident stands out in my memory. An elderly lady with the Voyageurs National Park Association, I believe, noticed that many trees had been cut down on the west side of the Kubel Island Channel. That's why we need a national park here, she said, not realizing that the deed had been done by beaver. The polls were taken and published as to the public's opinion of whether or not a national park should be established in far northern Minnesota. The polls showed strong support for the park in the southern part of the state and nationally. Most opposed were from this immediate area and the northern part of the state. Those supporting the proposed park were able to get high-profile celebrities to help him in their cause. Most notably was Charles Lindbergh, who visited Kettle Falls on October 4th, 1969, and had lunch. He also rented a small plane from Francis Einerson and toured the Kaptogama Peninsula by air. But by the time 1969 came around and I'd finished college and I received a job offer from Uncle Sam I could not refuse. So on June 16th, I was off to San Diego for a 2-year stint with the United States Marine Corps. Letters from home seldom, if ever, mention the proposed park. However, Mary joined me in June of 1970, and we got the Daily Journal delivered to our San Diego apartment. Now we were back in the loop. I still remember hearing and reading that President Nixon signed Voyageurs National Park into law in January of 1971. Prior to President Nixon signing the bill authorizing the park, I found out later that a lot had been going on in my absence. In August of 1969, hearings were held in International Falls on Representative John Blotnick's bill to authorize Voyageurs National Park. Following July, additional hearings were held by the House of Representatives in Washington, D.C. In October of 1970, the House approved Voyageurs National Park legislation and sent the bill to the Senate. The Senate approved the bill with amendments and then sent it back to the House. Now, that sounds familiar. But then on January 9th, 1971, it was signed by the President. The state of Minnesota then donated the land it owned within the borders of the proposed park to the federal government in May of 1971. I do remember talking to folks after that during those hearings, it got rather heated at times. Mary and I returned to Kettle Falls in June of 71, and I was immediately introduced to Merle Brooks, who was project manager of the park. Shortly after, I met 3 men who became lifelong friends. Joe Kale, Lee Grimm, who is right next to me here, and Raul Luftberry. All 3 remain in the area and are retired here. During Merle Brooks' tenure at Voyageur, we had many visits and many discussions of the park and its policies. We did not always agree, but my parents became good friends of Merle, and he always seemed to have Kettle Falls and the Kettle Falls Hotel best interests in mind. Meanwhile, the original Kettle Falls Hotel was deteriorating rapidly. The wooden foundation had rotten away and the ground floors were soft. Paint was peeling, plaster was falling off, and the whole building had a musty odor. The sewer system was failing miserably. Ironically, there was no enforcement. Business was booming, and the St. Louis County Health Department wrote page after page of health and safety violations. So many violations we could not keep up. But as I mentioned, there was no enforcement. Business was booming, and the hotel had great support from both sides of the equation. Also, it was my opinion that the National Park Service officials, in discussions with both the county and the state, promised that the problems would be solved once the park was established. On April 8th, 1975, Voyageurs National Park was officially established as the 36th national park in the United States. Gerald Ford was president at the time. Merle Brooks then became its first superintendent. Some weeks before the establishment of the park, 5 weeks actually, Irv Anderson, Senate Majority Leader in the Minnesota House of Representatives, was able to get legislation passed to form the Citizens Council on Voyageurs National Park. It would consist of 16 members appointed by the governor and legislature, and its purpose was to provide citizen output on park decisions. 4 years between the authorization of Voyageurs and its establishment, business was as usual at Kettle Falls. The hotel seemed to get busier every year, and for me, my guiding, fishing, hunting, trapping, snowmobile continuing. However, we all knew that change was in the works. I'm going to close my part of the talk with the celebration party that the park had at Kettle Falls in midsummer of 1975. It was attended by a lot of people, and but what stood out for me was that both Sigrid Olsen and Ernest Oberholzer were there. And I can still see them sitting and visiting on the steps of the hotel. I wish I would have had a camera at the time. But then I was thinking just a few minutes ago here, something else happened during that celebration. The fire started on the point where the villas now are at Kettle Falls. And it was a nice sunny day, but a couple of dozen of the men that were at the celebration went over and were able to extinguish it pretty quick. And I always thought that it was too much of a coincidence that fire would just start up on its own when everybody's attention was there to celebrate the park. But that's what happened. But now, Ashley and Bob.
Great job, Mike. All right, so I'm going to cover the land acquisitions, which I think was the greatest point of contention for most locals and the thing that people least fondly remember. In the beginning of 1975, $5.1 million was included in the federal budget that was sent to Congress for land acquisitions for the 1976 fiscal year. And this would be at the time the largest request for parkland acquisitions. However, legislation dictated at the time that the state had to donate land to the federal government before the NPS could start a general land purchase program. So in the prior year, in December of 1974, Minnesota had completed their donation of 32,000 acres to the feds to establish Voyageurs National Park. And eventually Minnesota would complete this donation of 37,000 acres. Now, after the park was formally established, as Mike said, on April 8th of 1975, the NPS began to work towards acquiring private land holdings. And immediately their sights were set on the single largest property owner, which was Boise Cascade's land holdings. Now, Boise Cascade, as the largest landowner, owned approximately 1/3 of what was hopefully to be Voyageurs National Park. And they began negotiating purchases for 50,000 acres from Boise. Now, those negotiations started in 1975, and in 1975, because the park plan had already been released, there was a lot of contention and issues that were arising amongst local groups over the land acquisitions and the price points that were potentially going to be offered. So people were already rallying to jack up those land prices, which assisted the mill in getting a better deal, along with their own land negotiations, because initially the NPS had lowballed Boise significantly for that 50,000 acres. So by the first half of 1976, NPS acquires that 50,000 acres for $11.2 million. So it was a substantial purchase. Now, after purchasing those lands from Boise, they now move on to the individual private properties that were, next in line. Now, like I said before, there's already contention building amongst locals regarding the land acquisitions, but also land usage. A lot of people were upset about the park boundaries, including property that was in the Gold Shores and Black Bay area, and this was due to the potential loss of hunting rights. There was also the argument over state versus federal regulation on the water, who was going to control or have the jurisdiction over that. Aviation guidelines and a potential airplane ban was also discussed. The Park Service was holding hearings, and citizens were encouraged, obviously, to attend, to ask questions or offer suggestions or simply to complain. And there were some individuals, Charles Helleloyd was one of them, that suggested that because you are creating essentially a waterlocked park, that aviation would be extraordinarily beneficial in the park and should be well utilized to help move all these visitors that we were expected to get across the park in a safe and more efficient manner. And instead of having a hard and fast ban, that you should continue to allow aviation and then regulate as issues were arising. In 1977, John McCarthy organized a group that would be known as the Voyageurs Park Landowners Association. Their aim was essentially to establish a group that could cross-reference and compare land values as they were being approached by the park's land acquisitions office, because nobody wanted to see those people coming for them. And these owners held a substantial amount of property that NPS had their sights on. Roughly 20 to 30 miles worth of shoreline in totality. So we're talking about thousands of acres between like roughly 40-ish people out of a larger group. In September of '77, they brought in a lawyer. It was Jerome Shermone from Shermone's Law Enforcement here in town. And then two other appraisers from Grand Rapids, and this was under the suggestion of a gentleman named William Essling, who was an attorney. And Essling was famous for challenging government land acquisition practices and policies, so this was kind of a nice little card for them to have in their pocket. So once they were starting to get those appraisals, they could have something to go back with against the park when they were starting to give offers. Now, McCarthy and others did feel that the park's definition of market value was unnecessarily vague in their words. The park, they felt that if the retail value of the land was not considered fair market value in the Park Service's opinion, then what was fair market value to the Park Service? What they were offering and the comparable sales that they were using at the time were considered, and I quote, ridiculously low. Now, the other aspect that comes into play with land acquisitions was, of course, the tenancy options that people were given. Now, when the state donated their land, if you had state leases or anything like that and your lease was up, you immediately had to vacate. But if you were a property owner and you did choose to sell your land, you were given two options. Of course, I'm sure many of you might be familiar with these, but there was life tenancy or tenancy up to 25 years. And the life tenancy, the intent of that legislation was to provide the property owner and his or her spouse tenancy for as long as either lives, but you could also give that tenancy to anyone whose name appears on the deed as legal owner. So a lot of people at the time were putting it into their grandchild or great-grandchild's name, and then that would prolong the time that you were there. 25 years, that would be an option that might have been good for somebody who was elderly because they could will that 25 years to someone else. But those were the options that you were given. Now, the biggest the other kind of thing that was going on, obviously, was the Black Bay issue. So the issue of hunting in Black Bay really became a major point by the end of 1975. September of that year, they had a 1,000 signature protest that was already getting going. And of course, we have some big key players here. that we'll talk about some more, but we have Vic Davis and Carl Brown and John Butch McHarg, and then numerous other people and hunting interest groups, things like that, that were fighting for the deletion of Black Bay from the NPS boundary. And they decided that despite the ban of hunting, that they were all going to hunt in Black Bay anyways that year. Because this was also bringing up again that fight over the jurisdiction of the water. So if they hunt in the water, well, that should be the state of Minnesota, and that would be the DNR that should be governing them, not the park. And the DNR, they absolutely wanted none of this mess, and they told them that they're not going to ticket anybody, they can hunt there. And so it was up to the park. So opening day happens. Carl Brown is, of course, out there in his boat killing ducks. And the Park Service had told them initially that they weren't going to ticket any of the people that were participating in the protest killing ducks because they can't legally prove where they shot the ducks. And if you had a gun in the park, that certainly doesn't mean that you're using it in the park. However, Carl was shooting ducks, and the park changed their mind, big surprise, that they were going to ticket people, and they ticketed Carl. And while Carl was being issued a ticket, there were ducks that were flying over, and he was like, hang on, I gotta do this. And so he shot some ducks while he's actively being ticketed, got his ducks, and then he went, everyone went their separate ways, and he had to deal with the repercussions of that. But obviously, we all know Carl, and he did not care. In October of 1975, the citizens suggested that Voyageurs National Park be a recreation area instead of a national park, which would allow the preservation of hunting, snowmobiling, trapping, timber harvesting, and they continued to push for that deletion of the 960 acres. Later, at that same time, there was a meeting held in Missouri, so a lot of citizens traveled there. They continued pushing for this rec area. They argued that the Park Service had originally promised that when the park comes in, oh yes, you'll be able to hunt and do all of these things, blah, 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 blah. And then the Park Service said, just kidding, you silly gooses, you can't hunt in a national park. And they took that all away. So the people felt lied to, and not only feel lied to, but they were lied to. So they were trying to find any means necessary to allow for, those recreational activities to continue to happen, whether that meant hunting primitively with bow and arrows and black powder rifles or whatever. But the park was not having any of that. So then we're going to jump forward a little bit because this gets more into the land fight again. And of course, we're going to have to discuss the Big Vic, Big Louie Davis debacle. So in January of 1980, Vic purchased property within the boundaries of Voyageurs National Park, and this was his 4-acre island, of course, of Little Cranberry that he says he purchased for $150,000. And his slogan at the time was that the federal land grab is like a vampire on the bloodline of the American dream. And this purchase of the property came the same week as the General Accounting Office had issued a report criticizing the federal government for wasting millions of taxpayers' dollars, basically funding these national land programs. And Voyageurs National Park was prominently at the top as wasteful. So while Davis and his cohorts, Butch and Carl, had bought this property, they made the decision that they were going to offer partnerships. So even you can own a piece of history. They divided 44,460 1-foot by 1-foot parcels that you could buy for $19.95. And by the time that Big Vic, the statue, was installed on the island in May of 1980, he had sold roughly 2,000 parcels. And if you'd like to know the math, that's $39,900 worth of little 1-foot by 1-foot squares. Now, sales of the plots, he had determined, he wanted to funnel this into a program that would educate the U.S. citizens of what he terms the unscrupulous policies of the National Park Service. Now, in speaking with Vic, he did not believe that the park was necessarily a bad thing. You know, he wasn't against it coming here. What he wanted was honesty and that people weren't going to get ripped off and like just be decent. And he had believed that the government could have let people sell the land on a willing basis and still establish the park. However, he felt that they were in this rush to turn the clock back, you know, within 5 years to make the land look like it did 200 years ago, and therefore made themselves, you know, a lot of enemies. So when he created Big Vic, his idea was that he would, quote, stand for the little people, those who have been ripped off by the feds, especially those in the VNPA and BWCA. Now, by October of 1980, things between Vic and the Park Service had really caught some fire, and Davis had announced in September of that year that he was going to start an outfitter's business and build a cabin. And newsflash, you're not supposed to build anything in the park at this time. So this was like not cool with the park. And the park decided, we don't like that idea, and we're gonna take your property. So they made this motion that they're going to seize his island, and Vic decided, okay, if you would like to take my island, I'm going to cut down every single tree on this island. And they didn't like that either. So that had to go. It went through legal recourse, and they had to make a decision on, first of all, is this legal, and how much do they have to pay him for this land if it is. Landowners also needed to be notified, so now they have to contact 2,000 individuals to let them know, hi, we're going to take this property, which I'm sure was probably a pain in the butt. Now, if this turned out to be illegal, they had to halt the entire process, but if it was legal, they would have to reach a settlement agreement, and then they only offered Vic $51,000, which he found outrageously offensive, because he had paid $150,000 for the island, $10,000 for Big Vic, $7,000 to fly him there. And then because his flight to fly Big Vic to the island was technically illegal, he was fined $250,000 by customs, which eventually got, you know, chewed down to basically nothing, but that was a whole nother battle. Now, Davis was ordered to remove Big Vic from the island, and initially he had plans to bury the statue because Vic is dramatic. But then he had a better idea, and his better idea was that he had purchased, of course, more property in the park, and this was a 26-acre chunk of land in Black Bay, which was the future spot of where the visitor center was. So he wanted to put Big Vic looking down on the visitor center. He wanted the Park Service, and I quote, when they pull up their blinds every morning, I want them to see the statue. I'm just telling them that we're still here. However, local residents opposed this idea, calling it an eyesore that would disturb the natural beauty of Black Bay. And without a place, so Vic had to go to the Cooch County Board and get a variance to put Big Vic in Black Bay. And that vote fell through. So he didn't have anywhere to put Big Vic. And without anywhere to put him, and because he didn't get him off the island, the government took that statue too. And then Vic found out later that he didn't actually need a variance to put him in Black Bay, so that really pissed him off. So then he decided, I'm gonna just build another statue. So that's what he did, and he sent money to Sparta, Wisconsin, and Big Louie was created. Big Louie was erected in Black Bay Narrows on May 14th of 1982, and he sat on 18 acres of property that the Wilderness Properties Group, which is what Carl and Butch and Vic had together, they had named it Voyageurs Park. And they were gonna have little picnic tables and barbecue pits, and I don't know if that came to fruition, but that's where Big Louie stood. And Big Louie was completely identical to Vic, except he weighed 900 pounds more, and he was a little bit more expensive. He was $16,000, whereas Big Louie was $10,000. And he, of course, sports a black beard instead of a red beard. And in the end, Big Vic and Big Louie stood in Voyageurs National Park for 3 years and 8 years, respectively, before the National Park Service, I'm sure, finally, after having an aneurysm dealing with these men, they were able to get them out of the park. Mayor Ed Woods at the time of Rainier wanted to have Big Vic placed in the entrance. The National Park Service was very reluctant to sell him, however, to Rainier because they felt that it would be, this statue was something that represented, a challenge to their presence, and to have him right on the corridor on the way to their visitor center, their largest visitor center, they thought that might be detrimental. However, of course, they yielded. They sold him to Rainier for $1, and Louis found himself a home in Barnum, Minnesota, outside of the Lazy Bear Grill. And to conclude their story, Vic in 1990 was awarded $1.2 million for his land in Black Bay, but he spent $500,000 fighting the Park Service. And it was, thanks to his efforts and others, it wasn't just him, there were other people involved, that the NPS ended up returning all of that hunting land in Black Bay. And this was the only instance of land cession in national park history. And in 1992, the rest of Vic's court proceedings, all of his cases that he had wrapped up, they finished. And the National Park Service respectfully said to Vic, please, for the love of God, never buy land in a national park ever again. And they wanted him to sign a document that he would agree to this, and he refused, but he did say that he would shake hands on it because a handshake meant more to him. And so he shook hands, and he says he doesn't own any property in a park. I don't know. But that was the conclusion of Vic and the land acquisitions.
So we have the debate of the creation of the park back in the 60s or 50s and 60s, and even before that a little bit. And then you have the challenges of the acquisition of the park and the lands within it. And then after the land is, or the park is established in 1975, then you have the challenges of management of the park and everything. And so the National Park Service comes into the area, and they are basically doing what Congress directs them to do and things. And one of the things that they are doing is trying to allow for snowmobile use within the park, which is clearly defined within the enabling legislation of the park, enabling legislation being the law basically that defines what the park will be and everything like that. And then also another thing that the Park Service is directed with is to assess the wilderness quality of new parks. And in the process of assessing the wilderness quality of a new park, they develop a wilderness recommendation. So these two things were very challenging in a variety of different ways. The establishment or the allowance of snowmobile use in the park was always was a thorn in the side of the Voyageurs Regional National Park Association, which is now the Voyageurs Conservancy, but at that time the purpose of the Voyageurs Regional National Park Association was very different than what it is right now, being a philanthropic partner of the park. At that time, the purpose of the Voyageurs Regional National Park Association was to assist with purchasing of land, and also was sort of being a watchdog of the park. And ultimately, they actually sued the National Park Service over snowmobile use in the park. The wilderness assessment that was required of the National Park Service, that was done, and basically the National Park Service did an assessment, and they developed a wilderness recommendation. And that, of course, was a surprise, I think, to a lot of the local residents who the National Park Service did not do a good job communicating to about why we had to do that, or why the National Park Service had to do that, and what the process was and everything. So that really caused a lot of fuel to the fire, basically, in the angst of having this national park here. And basically what happened with that was around our 20th anniversary, or the 20th anniversary of Voyageurs National Park in 1995, that culminated in a congressional hearing taking place here in International Falls, which ultimately 1,500 people attended at the high school and everything. And the debate was, should we continue to have Voyageurs National Park, or should it change in some way? And as I look around the room here, actually a very large number of the people in this room were part of that discussion in 1995 at the high school. And if you could, I know the room is not set up the best so everyone could see, but those of you who were involved in that discussion, please raise your hand. I was not. So I know a few of you around here and everything. So, this was a very contentious debate at the time, and it was basically, should the park remain, or should it be turned over to state or local management? Should it continue to be a national park, or should it be a recreation area? So this was a debate that took place and everything. And if you get the time to go into, I don't know if all of you are aware, but the Couchiching Historical Society has a great reference library or resources there that you can go in and explore if you're looking for details about stories like this. And also Voyageurs National Park has a archive as well that you can go and explore. But I know at the time, Tom Klein in our local, what was the name of the paper at the time? The Daily Journal, the International Falls Daily Journal, did a wonderful 6-series articles on this whole process and everything like that. So if you get a chance, you should try to find those articles and read them and things. But basically, it was that debate of what should we do. From reading Tom Klein's articles, the end result, though there were a lot of very strong opinions and everything like that, the end result was that people did feel that we should continue the national park, but that there needed to be better communication with between the National Park Service and the local community and everything like that. That being said, we did have those lawsuits that were filed, and eventually more lawsuits were filed, the outcome of which was that basically we could allow for snowmobiling in the national park, and we do today have a variety of about 150 miles of trails on the frozen lake surfaces and through the Chain of Lakes Trail and along the safety portages and things like that. The wilderness recommendation was completed, and that's all the National Park Service does, basically, is that we recommend, or the National Park Service, I have to stop doing that. I'm not with the Park Service anymore. But the National Park Service recommends wilderness, and then that's it. Basically, that recommendation sits there until Congress acts upon it. And Congress has never acted upon the recommendation that was submitted by the National Park Service. And considering the debate that took place during that time, the likelihood of Congress ever acting upon that is up in the air. It's still something that is yet to be determined and everything, but the likelihood is probably pretty slim. But that was the thing, basically, that in 1995, there was this culmination of this major congressional hearing here in International Falls in August, and there were a lot of very heated opinions at the time, but the way the papers reported it, and Mike, you can probably add to this a little bit, is the fact that people were pretty civil with each other and everything, even though people had very strong opinions about what was to happen and everything. So that's about all I have for the 1995 congressional hearing. So yeah, we can open it up to questions probably. I will say though that through the debate of the creation of the park, the establishment of the park, and the management of the park, which of course that debate continues on because there's always going to be things that come up, right? That we will always have to discuss in an open forum and everything like that. The fact that people are so, have such strong opinions related to this and are so willing to come out and have discussions and everything shows that obviously conservation is something that's very important to all of us, especially when it's in our own backyard and everything. Creation of Voyageurs National Park in 1975 is very different than many of the parks that were out west that were in areas that were not heavily populated and that were done much earlier in the century, in the 19th century and everything like that. But here in the Voyageurs area and International Falls area, where it was just 50 years ago, obviously there's a lot of people that were very, very closely involved and a very different process. So, yeah.
Well, thank
Thanks,
you, Bob.
Bob.
Yeah, thanks.
Well, at this point in time, we're open for questions.
There's still private property in Voyageurs National Park.
Yes, there is still private property, and I would say there's about 40 parcels still in
How are some people able
to retain.
to retain their property and others or not?
Yeah, so the question is, if you didn't hear it, how were some people able to retain their property and many others did not, and they ended up selling and everything. And really and truly it was because they just held out. They just waited it out until the government eventually got to the point where it was like, okay, we purchased the majority of the land and we will not actively, Congress had not actively set aside money for further purchases. But if there are private landowners that are willing landowners, the National Park Service is able to enter into conversations with them and potentially purchase that property. Of course, the people have the right to retain their property, and they can actually sell it to, if they're not willing to sell it to the federal government, they can sell it to another buyer as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, by 1980, the Park Service had adopted a willing buyer, willing seller policy over the land acquisitions. But originally, yeah, folks they still had the right to sell whether they wanted to or not. I think initially a lot of these sales, and Bob and I kind of had this conversation before, that there was a lot of like strong arm tactics used in the 70s for land acquisitions, and there was a lot of fear involved. Threatening, for the land. And even still now, the people that have property in the park, there are restrictions for what they can do on that property, with what they build and things like that. But they're still able to own it.
And a lot of those restrictions that are established are actually established through county ordinances and things like that. A lot of people don't realize it, but only 10% of the park is in Coochin County. 90% is in St. Louis County. Yeah.
My parents had a cabin on Kauai Island that they purchased with a 25-year lease.
I don't think you're turned on.
Is there,
So that lease was up in 2014, and the cabin is still there. It's kind of a wreck now. There's windows missing. My brother and I went and took as much lumber as we could off the deck.
Yeah.
When's that going to go away? I mean, it's a wreck. It's not doing anybody any good.
Yeah, very much like Ashley said, the National Park Service used some strong arm tactics to encourage people to sell their properties. I know one of the things that the National Park Service did, especially in the 1970s after properties were purchased, they would go in and they would burn the cabins, which is of course a slap in the face to the person that made the sacrifice of selling their property and everything. So the National Park Service stepped away from that practice of burning down cabins and then went into the practice of dismantling the properties and then salvaging the materials or sending the materials to the waste dumps and things like that. But now we can only do it when we have the money to be able to do that. And so unfortunately, we just have to, or the National Park Service has to wait for project money to come in to be able to do those activities and things. And project money is hard to come up by for that type of activity and things.
11 years.
Yes. I know that's one thing that the National Park Service, I think, had been talking with the Voyageurs Conservancy about in terms of how can we work with them to garner support for the removal of those properties, because very much like when a property is burnt down is disrespectful to the owner, to see the property deteriorate is disrespectful as well. So.
Yeah, there's other cabins also in the same boat. The Christensen and Case cabins on Rabbit Island, and then the Constantine cabin on Kauai, and of course the Ludwig cabin.
Yeah.
In addition to your parents.
They're all dead.
Yes, yeah, and they are a mess.
Yeah. So hopefully in the future we'll get the project money to do those projects, or they will. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any big changes coming to the park? New rules? Can't do that or stuff like that?
I don't know. I haven't been there for 6 months. No, I don't think so. No. We finalized just before I left, actually, the Frozen Lakes plan, and basically identified that, the use of different types of vehicles, as long as they are licensed and/or registered by the state, can travel on the frozen lake surface and everything like that. There's nothing else that I am aware of at all. Actually, I will bring this up. And the Secretary of the Interior just signed a secretarial order not too long ago, directing all of the agencies within the Department of Interior to relook at hunting restrictions and see where those hunting restrictions could be modified possibly in the future and everything. That's probably going to be a very long process and everything. So, yeah. Joe has a question over there.
Okay, so actually I was the original chair of the Citizens Council on Voyageurs National Park. That was many years ago, 1976, I believe. And I was appointed by Wendell Anderson because Irv Anderson asked him to appoint me. I think at the time I was 7. I actually was 27, 20 years old. The fact is that the Citizens Council, and I was off and on it, this might surprise people, but when there was a Democrat governor, I was on it, and when there was a Republican governor, I was off it. But the whole votes of every person on the committee, to my knowledge, was, I don't think they supported changing it to a recreation area, but you knew what the issue was. What we did have, and all the votes are recorded at the Minnesota Historical Society by law. The law that Irv passed to appoint the council. But the real issue was there was very specific language as to snowmobiling, aircraft usage, and other matters that has always been the issue. And Congressman Overstar, who was a friend of mine, and Mr. Durenberger, who was Governor Levander's aide at the time, who later became a U.S. Senator, who was not a friend of mine. That was the challenge, was the committee always voted to maintain the uses. And we actually had the hearing where we voted on 8 interior lakes. And I'm not even sure if they voted 8 interior lakes. But Charles Helloy did drive or fly people around, myself included. And we walked into the interior lakes with the help of Deacon Grimm over there. And he, back then and now, even though he's 80, went a lot faster than I did. So that really is something you should know about. Land acquisition, Merle Brooks made it very clear that they were going to acquire everything in the park. John McCarthy, most people would know as my best friend and drinking buddy, he chaired that group, started that group, and John bet that they wouldn't, and McCarthy family still owns an island in Voyageurs National Park. Because John was right, I owned an island in Voyageurs National Park because of the McCarthys. They didn't want to buy it, and a lady didn't want to sell it to the Park Service at the price, and she wanted to get out because she was old, and I bought it, but eventually I sold it because I wanted to get on Gold Shores before the prices got too high. I should have stayed. Anyway, but I was a city attorney and I couldn't build a house. Anyway, I'd just like to point out that there are many other issues that you guys haven't talked about. The most important thing is that this park is very important. The current issue is Kettle Falls. We have to make sure that Kettle Falls is developed, is maintained. My friend Chuck Williams might have replaced McCarthy as a drinking buddy. Told me that the costs, like for sewer and things, are prohibitive in the modern era. Yet, we, whether you're a Democrat, Republican, or whatever, have to be pushing to make sure that the Kettle Falls Hotel stays the way it is. And the Park Service should be paying for the cost of moving the garbage and all that kind of stuff, because otherwise we're going to lose a national treasure. I have a son-in-law that is from Pittsburgh, and the only reason that he sold his place in Montana was because he went out to Kettle Falls and back in a boat and told his wife after being on Voyageurs, why would I be in Montana when we got beautiful Rainy Lake? It was at the time my wife died with a houseboat provided by Billy Doherty, who was here. And the reality is that's the way it should be for everyone. But it's a national treasure, the park and Kettle Falls, and we have to make sure that that's affordable to run it. And one last mistake I'll tell you I have is I've stayed in those condos. I voted at the committee to approve those condos. And if you look in those condos, there's no view of the river in those condos. You have to get on the second level of the bunk bed. And for me, that's impossible. The lake, it was totally misdesigned, and I voted for it. So I made a few other mistakes in my life, but we got to make sure that Kettle Falls stays there, and it's there for the value of all of us. I will say one more thing. There was a number. I wrote a paper in law school because Bronco Sr. and Bronco Jr. talked about it, and that was my first wife. Bronco Sr. was my first wife's father. And because of the controversy, I wrote this paper. And the fact is, I called the guy up who actually made the appraisal of whatever it was, 1 point whatever million. And he said to me, well, I won't send you a letter, but what questions do you have? And I said, well, how did you pick that number? And he goes, well, it was simple, it didn't take very long. He goes, I picked a national park that I considered similar, and then I took 100 miles and 200 miles, and we got the same percentages coming to Voyageurs. That was in the western area where there wasn't any people, but when you take those percentages and stuff, we got into the Twin Cities, Minneapolis, and that's what we got the number. Really, unfortunately, was a number that people rely on. And I have to say, I have one last friend who was not a drinking buddy, but we socialized, Herb Anderson. And Herb's whole thing was, and he voted, he was the one who supported putting the land into the park. And Herb was always shocked that the Park Service didn't allow the uses that were negotiated and were in the bill for a national park. And to me, that's still the battle to keep all of those uses, which, because Voyageurs is No, well, it's different than the BWC. It has to be good. And otherwise, you would have Kettle Falls. Thanks.
Anybody else? No?
Do we have anybody else?
Why don't we charge admission for entrance or like a yearly pass? I just put $20 a night. How is money, seems to be a question for the park.
Why doesn't the National Park Service charge admission? It's primarily just because of the way the park is laid out and the fact that there is no succinct entrance point and everything. Obviously, we have the four gateway communities that we have visitor centers and boat ramps at. But then, obviously, you also have all the different resorts that people can go to that they can just boat into the park from the resorts. And then you have Canada as well and everything.
There's main entrances to those, and I guess what I'm getting at is, I know plenty of people that would be willing to pay a pass to put their boat on the water to get some of this money so that the park can do their flight to this area.
Yeah. So the question, if you didn't hear it, was why doesn't
It's their
the
water when it's convenient for them, but it's safe water.
Is this one?
so the question, if you hadn't heard, was why doesn't the National Park Service charge an entrance fee? And that's where I was coming from, the fact that there isn't a real true succinct entrance to Voyageurs and everything. But I hear what you're saying, and the fact that there might be support for that, and but there's probably very strong opinions on both ends of the spectrum of that and everything. So.
From what I understand, though, nothing's been talked about in the past.
No.
It's never been a thought.
No, not that I. Well, not really. No.
Got
Well, the Canadian border too is one of the challenges. You know, people coming all over. So it would be a challenge if the Park Service wanted to try to do an entrance fee type of fee and stuff. Obviously, we charge for amenities like the campsites, overnight permits for houseboats and things like that. So.
When the park was first started, I thought that it was, I thought incorrectly that it was going to be, just go back to wilderness. All the cabins would go away and it would just become, back to nature again. But I was happy that the park decided some of these properties had historical significance. They were just really interesting. The lives of the people that lived there, like Oveson's Fish Camp, Kettle Falls, Ellsworth Rock Garden, and my parents' cabin was right next to Fujita Island, formerly known by a three-letter word signifying the Japanese people island. And I didn't even know anything about his life until the park came in. And yet I visited with the people that owned that cabin for years. It's part of what makes the park an interesting place. Otherwise, it's just, oh, that's a pretty rock, nice trees, more and more of them, which I love. I feel good when I'm in the park, but I also like knowing these stories. And thanks for telling the stories.
I want to thank all of you for coming this evening. I have a cold night out there. I'm not sure when we're going to have our next History on Tap, but I know that we always have one here or outside here in Rainier for Rainier Days in August. Maybe one will pop up in between. If you ever have any subjects that you'd like discussed for History on Tap, just please give Ashley or myself a call and we'll see what we can do.
Yeah, thank you all for coming.
Thank you, everyone.